Hey everyone, welcome to the Lighthouse Wealth Group Spotlight Podcast with your host Sam Rice and myself, Tommy Derfler.
Good morning, everyone.
Yes, and as always, please don't forget to like, subscribe, um, comment if you like. We'd love to hear from you and any feedback you have or any topics you would like for Sam and I to discuss. But I think the topic we're going to talk about today is problems people face when retiring early and what can be the solution for these issues. So, I really like this topic because I think people have a really preconceived notion of what retiring early looks like. And they're just so happy to get to that finish line that sometimes they're a little bit blinded by certain areas that they maybe neglected or didn't think through. And sometimes these decisions can really backfire on you. And so, I think for Sam and I, what we really like to do is make sure that we're uncovering any and all blind spots for our clients. And so there's no surprises once you do decide to call it off, because one of the
Yep.
worst things that can happen is you retire early, you call it off, and then all of a sudden 10 years later you're thinking, uh-oh, this wasn't what I thought it was, or this
hmm
wasn't as fruitful as I thought it was with our lifestyle. And so it's going to be a great topic to dive into today.
Definitely. Right. You've got this big accomplishment that people strive for, being super frugal. Maybe they're trying to retire in their mid 40s even or early 50s. What a big accomplishment to be able to do. And then they get there and they're like, what next?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so I think that's one of the first things we ought to discuss is, looking at the idea of having so much time now, right? You have so much
hmm
time where for, your habits for the last 20, 30 years might have been getting up and going to work every day and being accountable um, and having those things. And all of a sudden you wake up one day and you don't have that anymore. So
That's
there
right.
could be, potential loss of identity um, and purpose, because we always tell people, hey, the first 6 months is going to be great. It really is, because you're out celebrating, you're doing things, you have energy, you're excited. And then usually, after the first 6 months, it's kind of they hit a wall and say, now what? You know?
That's right. Well, I feel like we typically like to prepare people a couple years in advance for this is a great goal and I'm glad you're able to achieve this. What an amazing accomplishment. But you really need to start planning your life out post retirement because, we'll come across people, maybe they have come to us after they've hit that milestone and they're trying to figure out how to manage their assets at that point. But it's like, well, we have to design a plan not only for your assets, but your life. What are you going to do with all this time after your honeymoon period of 6 months after retirement? What does the next 20 or 30 years look like if you're mid 40s or mid 50s that you're going to spend your days enjoying? Is it traveling with your family, maybe your wife or your kids, or your husband, or maybe you have a passion project, but you need to find that out before you get to there. I think
Exactly.
a lot of times that's the missed point in all of it.
Yeah, that's
You can
100%
retire
right.
early.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can retire early, but what's the point if you don't know what you're going to do next?
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like that's when you start getting in these areas where, you start spending more money because you're bored.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all of a sudden, the lifestyle you thought you wanted before retiring, all of a sudden, you know, gets exposed to saying, well, I'm getting really bored and I want things to do and a little bit of stimulation. So I'm going to go travel. I'm going to go, maybe
hmm
start a business, all these things that take a little bit more money than what you anticipated. And to your point, you've really got to think through that next chapter before you pull the plug. And I think what we've seen, if we've seen, clients say, hey, I'm going to take a part-time job, something that can cover my health insurance benefits.
Yep.
And at the
Big
same
one.
time, it's not going to be a huge mental drain. Maybe
Yeah.
it's something a little mindless, that you're accountable to, you have a sense of purpose for, that you just go do, and doesn't stress, you don't have to carry the stress of something like the corporate world does, but being able to have a better picture of that in mind prior to that time is hugely beneficial. So,
Certainly.
and we've seen things such as people getting involved in charities, and that's a big way to have a sense of meaning. And I think in Nashville, Tennessee, and the South here, a lot of people find a lot of meaning through getting involved in a lot of charitable work.
Certainly.
And
There's a huge philanthropic pull here
mm, yeah,
and
and we've
presence.
seen that done really well,
Hmm.
um, just to kind of fill that identity and purpose. Because what you don't want is drift, where you're just kind of
Yeah.
going along. And I think in that for retirement is very dangerous.
Yeah. And it's common, very common. Even if they've
Hmm.
set a whole plan together, the drift is real.
Yeah. So I think, a couple solutions, that is one, start thinking about this about 2 years prior to retirement. If you want to retire early and you have the financial resources to do so, that's great. That's a big part of this decision. I think the other part of this decision is the emotional and mental decision of this, and saying, okay, now what am I going to do? Because I'm a firm believer, once you have that drift and you don't have a sense of purpose, that'll start showing in you mentally. It'll start showing you physically.
Hmm.
And we want, that's the thing that we want to avoid is, hey, we could financially retire and this is great, but the quality of life went down because of that.
Which you wouldn't expect to happen, but unless you've got a dialed daily routine, even if you're not working full time, just having some form of a schedule is crucial to keep you active. And then I think another important part to all this too is people get to that point, and we see this even with regular retirees at 65 or what have you, somewhere along that age range, where they're thinking of their investments just to that time of retirement. But a lot of times they don't think about, we need to continue investing this money past and through retirement because, with lifespans these days, especially if you're retiring early, that money's got to last you a lot longer than if you were still working up until 65. Um, so what is a investment strategy that you need to implement that, you've got a conservative side, you've got a growth side that's still going to keep up with inflation and taxes. Um, and then again, not getting bored and spending more than you thought you would at
Yeah.
the same time.
Well, I think that brings up a good point too of outliving your money, because 2 generations ago it used to be that people were living to an average of 70 years, 65 to 70 years. They'd retire
Yep.
age 60, and they really only had 5 to 10 years, excuse me, to enjoy themselves. Now what we're
Yeah.
seeing is exact, it's people are living much longer. Healthcare is getting better, and pharmaceutical companies are keeping us around a lot longer.
Yeah.
And now I think the average lifespan for a woman is 90, around 95, and for men is around 92. So if you're
It's
looking at,
amazing.
yeah, if you're looking at retiring at 50, you're going to have more retirement years than you do working years.
Hmm.
And so making sure that you've got to have investments that are keeping up with two main factors. One is the inflation rate, because that'll erode it when you don't even see it. And the second thing is when Uncle Sam comes knocking at your door wanting their tax bill, or their tax money.
Yep.
And so that's, I think, two biggest threats to a retiree, and especially even more so the younger you decide to retire.
Yep. and you're more what at at mid 40s or earlier mid 50s, you still might have some sizable bills
Yeah.
like mortgages, maybe a car payment still. Hopefully, if you're feeling confident in that retirement frame um, kind of mindset, a lot of that stuff is probably taken care of. But man, you might still be paying for college for kids and stuff like that. So those bigger expenses that we typically don't see people have in a typical retirement time period, you may still be incurring those for another 10 to 15 years if you're retiring early. So thinking about those additional costs, prepping for that. And then I think there's another couple things that we could mention, um, like some huge costs like healthcare and just lifestyle costs, if you want to go a little bit more into that.
Yeah, and I want to go back. This kind of ties into what you were talking about earlier into lifestyle costs, but for anybody that retires that's not yet a grandparent, we've
Yeah.
seen and heard so many times
Yeah.
that there's a flip that gets switched. And once you become a grandparent, typically their world revolves around grandchildren.
Hmm.
And so if you're retiring early, there's a good probability you may not have grandchildren at that point.
Yeah.
And so what happens then is, once you have grandchildren, things change. Your lifestyle, your desires, your wants change. And now, hey, if they're not all in the same town, guess what? We've got to start purchasing tickets for flights,
We might
a
be
couple times a
flying or
year.
moving.
Yeah, exactly. If
Yeah.
you're not traveling all the time, you might be moving. There's moving costs associated with that. But
Hmm.
building in a budget regarding grandkids, I know, especially for grandmothers, it's like you ought to have a line item just for that. Gifts and treats for the
That's right.
grandchildren.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think um, your priorities shift, along that life cycle, and so you've got to be prepared for that. And that's harder to know the earlier you are. You don't know,
Definitely.
hey, our grandchildren are in the picture or are they not? We don't know, if our kids are getting married, and so you don't know these things. But
Your
I
kids could
think,
still be teenagers.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you're getting squeezed into the sandwich generation, right? So you could be in a situation where you start helping your parents because they're aging. And then at the same
Yeah, that's
time,
true.
you're also helping the kids because they may not be up on their own just quite yet and may need a little bit of help, whether that's financially or, your attention still. And
Yeah.
you're kind of sandwiched in between that. And that's just a reality the younger you are when you retire.
Yeah, there's more things to think about just within your family dynamics and additional costs if you're going to be able to make that jump to early retirement to account for, definitely. And
Yeah.
then probably one of the bigger costs is healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah, because Medicare doesn't start till you're 65, and
Yeah.
a typical policy can be, excuse me, more expensive than a group policy plan, right? Something through your employer, and we've seen in our situation, the cases we've been involved with, we've seen people go back and work just enough just to cover that expense alone.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, because on the independent market, if it's husband and wife and maybe you've still got kids or something like that, um, you're easily in the one to two plus $1,000 a month range for healthcare on the independent market.
Yeah.
So that's a big light item to account for if you're trying to make that jump to early retirement. So
Mm-hmm.
thinking about that as well as taking up a second job just to cover that healthcare expense, those are big things to weigh.
And also, it's a matter of there's ACA premium subsidies, right, where the government kind of helps out regarding your
Yep.
individual policies. But people tend to forget sometimes they have income limits to those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so now a lot of people are faced of, well, do I have to reduce my lifestyle in order to pay, or in order to reduce this expense? Or,
Hmm.
do I have enough to, no, I don't want to live under that income lifestyle. I want to live over that, but am I prepared for those higher costs too? And so that is a big part of juggling a lot of those decisions and forcing you to expose that and say, hey,
Hmm.
the last thing you want to do is have this preconceived notion of, oh yeah, the government's going to help me pay for this prior to 65. And all of a sudden, you know, these costs go up as your income goes up. And it's like, whoa, we weren't expecting that.
Oh yeah. I think one of the other really important things that we definitely need to touch on too is, people may have been saving in 401ks or retirement accounts for a certain amount of years, probably doing really well contributing to those. Um, but sometimes a lot of people don't factor in the fact that you can't pull out of them without penalties until a certain age. So are you prepared for that as well?
So
And
there's,
or missing out on that match, free money.
see, yeah, I was going to say there's two sides of that coin, and they both do not help in your case of retiring early. One is you can think of it as essentially a loss of income from any kind of employer matches.
Hmm.
Because if you were to put in 3%, the company puts in 3%, you're getting 100% return based just on the contributions alone.
That's right.
And so now you take that out of the picture, you're no longer accumulating wealth nearly as fast as you were when you're taking advantage of, either HSA contributions or tax deductions from pre-tax accounts or even HSAs. And so your taxes go up from that point. But you're right. On the accumulation side, you're missing out on those opportunities. And then on the distribution side, most retirement accounts have the age 59 and a half
Hmm.
um, age requirement in order to take money out without certain penalties. And so, which typically means either you got to have income from other sources,
Hmm.
whether it's rental income, it could be capital gains, part time
Yep.
job, or something like that. Um, or, in a there are, you know, in 401k plans, they do allow early
Yep.
distributions, penalty free, I should say, not tax free, but penalty free. And then there's also for an IRA, a cool little loophole. It's called the 72T, where you can
Yeah.
take money out systematically, but there are certain things attached to that you have to be aware of if you decide to do
Yep.
that prior to these ages of 59 and a half.
Yeah, you kind of got to set that plan in stone if you're going to utilize it.
Exactly. So I think you're right. You got to be watch out for those early withdrawal penalties on some of these accounts, and really plan for something outside of those accounts, such as a brokerage account, non-qualified
Hmm.
account, where you can have money set aside that you can pull from that do not have those penalties associated with it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the other great ways to get familiar with an advisor is to educate yourself on those different types of accounts that, you know, if you are looking to retire early, what are some of those ways in which we can navigate that cash flow without subjecting yourself to penalties and planning that on the front end rather than thinking, oh man, I've got these great investment accounts through my work, my 401k, I've been building that for so long. It's grown tremendously. Man, I feel like I can retire now. And then they get hit with this, reality check that, oh, that's actually kind of locked up for maybe 10 to 5 to 10 more years possibly.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you're kind of back at the drawing board. So planning early for that, as, if people are trying to shoot for an early retirement, they probably are, but getting together with an investment advisor and a planner, I mean, would make that process so much easier and just give people a better peace of mind
Oh
through
yeah.
that process.
Yeah, because when we run these simulations, right, to do stress testing, which
Hmm.
says, hey, what's worst case scenario here? We want to be able to address that ahead of time to say, hey, do we have a certain probability of weathering these storms? And if we do, what does that look like? Do we need to strategically plan for these times? What does that look like? But it's funny because um, when we do these financial plans for our clients, you know, we'll sit there and say, hey, we try to mirror the crystal ball, right? Like if we could try to recreate this crystal ball based on all
Yeah.
these assumptions and these lifestyle factors that the client's looking for, and we were lay it out and say, hey, if this were to work truly with this certain investment rate of return, and here's our other sources of incomes and play that out. Well, what happens a lot of times, the younger you are, you'll have this big cushion. I mean, you could have $5 to $10 million. That's your end of the plan, which means the end of your life, left over, but your probability might not be as high as you might think. And so we get these comments all the time of like, I don't get it. There's so much more left over at the end of our plan, but our probability is not really where we want it. Why is that? And our response to that is because this is where time works against you. You're going to live
Yeah.
through more bear markets. You are going to have lifestyle changes. You are going
Yep.
to,
Family changes.
family changes. This is factoring in that the longer you have in retirement, the higher risk that is. Whereas on the flip side of that, you could have much smaller amount of assets, of investable assets, but you're a lot older. Well, the risk shrinks a little bit because
Yeah.
now you're not going to live through 2, 3, 4, 5 bear markets all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And so that
Maybe
risk,
two.
yeah, so that risk factor goes down. And so you don't need to have that big of a cushion because, it
There's less
becomes
unknowns.
exactly
Yeah.
less
I mean,
unknowns.
because, if you're retiring in the mid 40s, you're planning for another 20 years of spending, cash flow, and unknowns than the typical retiree, or when you're going to potentially pull Social Security, when you're going to have healthcare covered for you by Medicare. Like you know, it's an amazing accomplishment, but you got to plan for a lot more unknowns,
Yeah.
certainly.
And I think this is the fun part for us is this is where financial planning becomes more of an art than a science.
Yeah.
It really is much more of an art. There's no perfect black, white, right, wrong. It's what's working for you and your family. What are you trying to accomplish? Let's really nail those things down. And it's kind of like putting a puzzle together. If you were to ask somebody, what's the first thing you do when you have a 500 puzzle piece puzzle to put together? And they say, well, the first thing you do is you need to put the corners, you got to find the corner pieces and build from there. And the answer is, hold on, time out. No, the first thing you do is look at the front of the box to know what you're trying to piece together. And you have to have
Yeah.
that visualization of, hey, this is what we're trying to put together before really starting to connect those puzzle pieces. And that's exactly what we do is, yeah, we can jump into the investments. We can jump into the risk factors of all this stuff. But the first thing we need to know is, what are we trying to accomplish with this?
What's the why?
Exactly. And then because so many times what we've seen is we'll see people taking maybe a little bit more risk than they should be taking. And, some people are fine with that. They say, hey, I can handle that. I know how this works. I've experienced in that. Perfect. Great. They know the expectations that come with that. And then other people say, hey, we want to achieve the highest rate of return. And we look at their plan and say, well, we can do that, but you're taking unnecessary risk. If
Yeah.
you don't want to leave a legacy, if you're looking to use and spend all of your money within your lifetime, then we can do that in a way that we don't need to take more risk than necessary.
Yeah. I feel like that's probably one of the most common things I think that we run into is that people a lot of times when they come to us, when we're comparing investment strategies, they just automatically go for, what's potentially the highest rate of return option. But at the same time, one of our main jobs is to reel them back in, saying, you've got these great goals. We can still achieve those without taking on additional risk to your plan and to your financial well-being. And a lot of people um, just don't think of it that way. When they think of investments, they think of returns
Yeah.
inherently, and
And there,
we need to like flip that for them.
and you know what? The same goes for if people have certain family goals and values and they want to leave a legacy. They want
Hmm.
to start developing generational wealth, then that might suit them saying, hey, this is great. You have more than enough and it truly is to grow the money. Then here are the risks associated with the returns. And as long as you're aware of that and accept that and know that, great. That's where you can do those things. And
Hmm.
so, kind of like what I was saying earlier, this is good financial planning is much more of an art than a science.
Yeah, it's deep conversations with clients. It's finding out the root purposes in their life. It's what drives them, what's their passions. Because, right, if you want to retire early, you don't want to be running from something that's been draining you, but you've been doing really well at it. You want to run towards something.
And
Like you want to have that passion, that goal. Maybe it's to start a new business. Maybe it's to become, a mentor in your community, given your experience that you've had in the past. But you want to make that jump with a purpose.
well, I love how you said that, which is running to or retiring to something, not from something, because you can always run away from what you don't want, but you don't still have an idea of what you do want. You just know what you don't want. And so by, having that desire to pursue other things, now you can learn to leave the past alone and say, great, I had a great time there. That was awesome. This is my next chapter. I'm looking ahead, not behind. Where too many times when people retire from something, it doesn't work out the way they want it typically.
Yeah, and even for people that aren't retiring early, I feel like we run into this a lot. Like they've been grinding for many years. They're focused just on a certain number that they think they need to have. And they're like, I just need this number. I just need this number. And then I can let go of this job that I'm really good at, but I'm not really passionate about it anymore. But it fulfills everything. It pays the bills. It adds to my savings. It adds to my investments. It takes care of my family. I'm chained to this because it provides so much for my well being. And they just want to find a way to get out of that. But then if you pull the plug, you haven't planned for that next step. And that's the most important piece because, if you plan for that next piece, that next phase, it can actually give a lot of relief to your current situation. And it
Hmm.
can give purpose behind that current situation. So maybe it's like, maybe you do have a fantastic goal. Maybe you want a vacation house and you realize that, hey, maybe we're not really there yet. Like we could retire, but we're not really there yet to be able to buy a second home or to do this, whatever. But it gives you that extra drive and peace of mind in your current job to be able to last out those next couple years with purpose
Hmm. Absolutely.
and not such dread. Like we're doing this for something now, more than just a number amount. It's for it's for a life. It's for a next chapter, not
Yes.
just trying to pull the plug.
Exactly. And I think all of this, when we talk about retiring early, if that's somebody's goal and that's what they want to do, great. We're going to encourage that. We're going to help them out as far as the technical side. We're going to, look at the risk involved, and we're going to look at the entire financial picture to make sure everything's working congruently with one another. And if that's what you want to do and you say, hey, I'm willing to face these things and I understand it, great. I think the whole goal of this is having a regret from misjudged timing. That's what we
Yeah.
want to prevent, is that regret. And the other part of this too is, it's harder to go back. So when you
I was
do
just going to
find
say the same
out,
thing. Yep.
when you go back, people are going to see on a resume, hey, what happened here? You weren't fine tuning your craft, whatever that may be, to help an organization. You might have lost touch a little bit with the corporate world, or, being an entrepreneur. So it's really, really difficult that if you find out that you did make a mistake and say, man, I think I did this a little bit too early, it's just really hard to go back. Not that it can't be done, but
Mhm.
you just want to make sure, you know, um, you don't have
Maybe that
those
is your goal.
regrets.
Yeah. You don't want to have the regrets, but you want to have some autonomy, right? If you just want to
Mm-hmm.
take a break for a year or two and then reassess things, make sure you're not just totally disassociating yourself from your career, your network of folks to be able to make that jump back in if you did want to do that, but just on a different level or a different role. Um, Planning to keep all those relationships fresh and not just sail off into the sunset for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm going to wrap it up here, but hopefully this was helpful for a lot of people and gave a lot of people things to think about.
Mhm.
That's what we want to do here at Lighthouse Wealth Group. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube as well. And of course, our website at www.lighthousewealthgroup.com. But we appreciate you listening today. And yeah, just appreciate it. So, Sam and I are going to sign off the Lighthouse Wealth Group Spotlight Podcast. Thanks, everyone.
See you on the next one.